Now, it's self-evident human endeavors can't grant divine authority. The divine appointment must come from the divine, not from history. So we can't use history, which is a human endeavor, because we can't grant divine authority. Only the divine can grant that. And if we're going to rely on history, we're retreating back to a human endeavor, a historical record, to decide what is or isn't divine. And as IAS and AQU, when in their pages talking about the Imamat, they said the Shia's espousal of the right of Ali and that of his descendants through Fatima to the leadership of the community was rooted above all in their understanding of the Qur'an and its concept of qualified and rightly guided leadership, as reinforced by prophetic traditions. Notice what it says here. It's their espousal or their claim to the leadership was above all rooted in their understanding of the Quran. Now, we may or may not agree with that. That's a separate issue, but it was rooted in the Quran, in the divine. And then it's just reinforced by the prophetic tradition, which are the historical record. So that even they are saying basically it's the divine authority must come from the divine. Of course, you have to confirm what is coming from the divine is actually from the divine. History can only reinforce that and say, yes, well, that's been supported by all of this historical record. So that's a really important distinction that they are making there. So now let me look at the traditional ways of confirming the Imamat and their problems, and then we can get into. Then I'll be moving into the new approach, which is what I'm also going to be outlining with part 2 here, chapter 2. So the traditional way of assessing or authenticating or validating the Imamat, however you want to, whatever level of certainty you're trying to establish, is, are we attempting the impossible here to some extent? And generally, traditional Imam proofs try to, and I put proofs in quotation marks because we can't really prove anything, as I said. You can only get a certain level of intellectual satisfaction. So if I use the word proof or validation, it's just basically a word because that's how we speak. But really what we're trying to do is get a certain level of intellectual satisfaction, which some people will be satisfied, some people won't be, and they'll need different levels of evidence. And so the traditional approaches try to confirm that first Allah exists. And again, technically, as I said, we can't prove Allah exists because he's above all reason. Then that Allah communicates with mankind, brings down, he actually does communicate through a prophet and so forth. That in our case, and as Ismailis, the Quran is from Allah. We have to show that that's the case, and that would be showing it came from the prophet, and the prophet was, Allah communicated with the prophet, so they're all tied together. And then the Quran is uncorrupted, because that's important, because if it's corrupted, then we don't know if what we're reading is accurate or not. And we're talking about here is textual integrity, in the sense that the words and letters and so forth are not corrupted, they're not missing, there's no additions and so forth. And then we have to show that the Quran insists it requires an interpreter appointed by Allah, because remember, we're trying to prove the Imamat, so at some point, the Quran, if we've proven all 1 to 4, now has to, because the only thing we can rely on is the Quran now must tell us that it requires an interpreter. And of course, that interpreter has to be appointed by Allah. And then we have to establish who was the first interpreter appointed, that one was, and who that was, to make sure that actually somebody was appointed and correctly identify who that was. And then, of course, we need to have subsequent interpreters appointed through to the present day, because that is what the Imamat is. It's this entire chain of interpreters who are interpreting the faith for us, and there's a whole chain, a link, line of them, and we have to confirm all of those were appointed, and they are the correct people, and we haven't somehow been misled and gone onto the wrong line or following somebody who's not one of these authentic interpreters. So that's what that's what's generally tried to be done to confirm the Imamat in the traditional approach. And that's a heavy lift to confirm. You have to confirm all of this. Your conviction and confidence in the Imamat is only going to be as good as the weakest link in there, because if some part of this you're not satisfied with, well, then everything after that doesn't follow through. If you don't believe the Quran came from Allah, then everything else, number 4, 5, 6, 7, you're not going to be they're all going to be compromised because you're already not accepting the Quran, or you have not satisfied the Quran is from Allah, and you're looking for more evidence of that to satisfy you. That's the case. So let's take a look at that and see how little is actually solidly founded, even though we might be accepting it, but in terms of evidentiary based, how little is that? Notice how little is solidly founded. And I'm directing this to the skeptic, because of course the skeptic is going to be quite happy to point this out. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. Let them point it out. So the first claim was Allah exists. There were 7 steps there, and I'm going to go through all 7. The reliance that Allah exists is fairly strong. It's on philosophy, which is like the first cause arguments from Aquinas and so forth, or with science, the design argument, as I mentioned earlier, which is what both of those are what convinced Anthony Flew. He both the philosophy, traditional philosophy, the first cause argument, and various discoveries in science. The basis is evidence, so it's fairly good, and the strength is excellent because we do have good, very good arguments and evidence for Allah exists. Now, the fact that Allah communicates with mankind, our reliance on that is the historical record. We have to trust that's happening. So the evidence and the strength of that is relatively weak, and I'm calling that weak because it's based on trust. We don't have any real evidence, so it's not it's not our confidence that Allah communicates with mankind is weak, even though we might have a lot of evidence of that. We're still basing it on trust and basing the trust on the historical record. The trust is based on the historical record. That the Quran is from Allah, again, is based on the historical record of what happened with Prophet Muhammad and so forth. Again, that means it's trust-based. We have to trust the historical record. It's not evidence-based. We can confirm today. We have to trust the historical record, assume that all of that's fairly correct. And some of it is, and some of it's not, but the strength of that, of course, is going to be relatively weak, again, because it's a trust-based reliance, or a trust-based perspective rather than an evidence-based perspective. Now that the Quran is uncorrupted, again, that requires a historical record because the Quran has been passed down through us through time. Its basis, again, is trust, but at the same time, its strength is quite reasonable because we have a chain of these going very close back to the original Quran within 15, 20 years, I believe, of when the Quran was revealed. It was never written down at the first moment. Of course, it was written a little bit later, but we do have some good evidence to show going at least back to within 20 years of the revelation. We have manuscripts to show that what we have it's relatively or is uncorrupted, even though we're based on the historical record. We do have some evidence for that too. So it's trust and evidence in that respect. Now the Quran insists it requires an interpreter appointed by Allah. Our trust for that is from the Quran itself. Now that's circular in the sense that it's the Quran saying you're going to need an interpreter. So there's no independent evidence of that other than the Quran claiming it about itself. So that's relatively weak. Circular logic is not very good. And similarly, you'll find sometimes the Imamat will tell us that such and such, there's been reports and documented cases of the Imam saying that in the past, such and such ayat refers to us. Well, again, for a skeptic, that's rather circular. You're saying, well, the Imam's saying we need an interpreter, and here's the ayat, and it means that, even though when you read it, you may not understand it. Of course, once you've confirmed the Imam is who he says he is independently, then of course you can begin to look at what he's saying and say, right, that's where the trust-based faith can come into play, or some blind faith, because we may not know what that is. We can never know the exact interpretation of every ayat. That's what the Imam is there to confirm and show us. And then we might even be able to see, right, it makes sense now if you've confirmed the Imamat and you're satisfied about the Imamat. When you read that, you'll actually see it. That, oh yes, how that's correct now. If we're looking at it from the right perspective, it makes sense. That the first interpreter was appointed, again, that relies on the historical record. There's contested evidence about that and the debate over the meaning of Mola, which is, of course, this is the whole incident at Ghadir Qum. But the strength is reasonable. It's fairly good. I wouldn't call it excellent, but it certainly is reasonable, even though it's still based on the historical record. The Ghadir Qum event itself is very heavily documented, even in Sunni sources. So that's good. And that subsequent interpreters are appointed, which is after Hazrat Ali. Again, we're relying on the historical record there. There's some contested evidence and there's some gaps. So both of those together, there's some weak areas in that in the historical record because of the gaps or missing records. But overall, it's fairly reasonable. But those weak areas compromise confidence and conviction because of the point about gaps in the historical record. And I'll be dealing with all of that later on, as I mentioned in the introduction there. These two areas, which are we following the right branch? Because that was one of the issues when there are branches and splits. And the other issue is because there are gaps or thinly documented sections in the historical record, some of them create some doubts in some people's minds, and I'll be showing those. We don't have to worry about those as we get into that later on. So that's the overall picture here, and as you can see, the historical record is being relied on quite a bit for 5 of those 7 steps, and because of that, we end up with weak or reasonable confidence or in the strength of the assertion of the Quran is from Allah, or whatever the claim is. Now, the historical record can't grant divine authority, and we're relying on the historical record for 5 of those 7 claims that we need to authenticate or confirm to some level of satisfaction, intellectual satisfaction. Now, it's self-evident human endeavors can't grant divine authority. The divine appointment must come from the divine, not from history. So we can't use history, which is a human endeavor, because we can't grant divine authority. Only the divine can grant that. And if we're going to rely on history, we're retreating back to a human endeavor, the historical record, to decide what is or isn't divine. And as IAS and AQU, when in their pages talking about the Imamat, they said the Shia's espousal of the right of Ali and that of his descendants through Fatima to the leadership of the community was rooted above all in their understanding of the Quran and its concept of qualified and rightly guided leadership, as reinforced by prophetic traditions. Notice what it says here. It's their espousal or their claim to the leadership was above all rooted in their understanding of the Quran. Now, we may or may not agree with that. That's a separate issue, but it was rooted in the Quran, in the divine. And then it's just reinforced by the prophetic tradition, which are the historical record. So that even they are saying basically it's the divine authority must come from the divine. Of course, you have to confirm what is coming from the divine is actually from the divine. History can only reinforce that and say, yes, well, that's been supported by all of this historical record. So that's a really important distinction that they are making there. The prophetic traditions, which are basically the historical record, just reinforces the claim. It does not make the claim, does not grant them the divine authority. So being a human endeavor, it's obvious the historical record will always have flaws. Obviously, if something has flaws, and it can't be giving divine authority. And even our Imams expressed doubts about historical events. In 1964, Hazram was talking about a hadith, and he said there's another hadith, and he just qualified it right away, which may or may not be correct. And that's exactly why it's just the tradition, hadith or the prophetic traditions can only they can help confirm something, but we can't rely on them as the original source for divine authority. They can help confirm it. So that's why he's even saying, well, the hadith may or may not be correct. Similarly, Imam Mansour, when he was talking about some fact about Abu Bakr, he said that he'd led the prayer. So, well, that's not historically certain. So again, they themselves are expressing doubts about the historical record as that, it's useful, certainly, obviously, but it's not ability to give us more intellectual satisfaction. And we'd like a little more than that when we're dealing with something relating to divine. We'd like to at least get to the divine, so we know we are getting it from the divine. Now, the Quran itself, like I said, is part of the historical record, although the text is most likely uncorrupted. It still is written and copied by people and is subject to errors. And all we can do is trust that it's not and look at some evidence to show, yeah, it's fairly good right the way back to within 20 odd years of the revelation when it was first written down. I think, it's people have a lot of confidence it's good, and some people have intellectual satisfaction that's sufficient for them. Others say, well, that's not enough. We have no idea what happened in between there. So, and that's fine. They're entitled to that skepticism. That's they haven't got that intellectual satisfaction. And I talked about that quote of Hazram where he last time, which in the last section, which talked about this practicing the faith. You must practice the faith with the intellectual context of your time, and our context is very skeptical. So it's perfectly legitimate, and they're people's right to demand more evidence or more satisfactory evidence for themselves.